So good morning, and thanks, Ron. I will mention that Jamie will be joining us, but through a video presentation, which is coming up later on in the presentation. As Ron mentioned, I will be presenting on the topic of performance management, and this is in keeping with the theme for this year's firm seminar, which is all about proactive management. As you will have no doubt surmised from the title, the focus of this presentation is about achieving effective performance management through a balanced approach to progressive discipline. Now, this is obviously a huge topic, and it's one that I can't cover extensively in the time that I have with you. So for that, I will commend you to a paper that was co-authored by Jamie Knight and by me, with substantial contributions from one of our absolutely fabulous summer students, Danny Parker. Technology does work. So for turning first to the agenda, just to give you a brief overview of the topics that I'll be covering, we will be looking at performance management, what I call 101, some of the basic precepts that inform the concept of performance management, and then having a little bit of a discussion about Goldilocks Principle, which is not something that I invented. It actually is a principle of both of economics, astronomy, and of law. We'll be moving there from that point to progressive discipline and just a review of the stages, and then finally a topic that is of tremendous interest to most of our clients, which is establishing a cause dismissal. Finally, we'll be having the aforementioned video presentation. Now, performance management, interestingly, it's a term that was coined about 30 years ago. And in its broadest, most basic element, it describes the methodology for ensuring that goals are consistently being met in an effective and efficient manner. At its most basic, performance management, whether it's in reference to the management of an operation in its entirety or of an individual employee, it's a management right, which then begs the question, well, what is a management right? Well, you'll know from your experience that management can do whatever it wants in pursuit of the objectives of the workplace. You'll also know from your experience that this management right, this inherent management right, is subject to some limitations. Those limitations are in the forms of statutes, the common law, for those of you who work with unionized employers, collective agreements, and also self-imposed limitations. By self-imposed limitations, I'm referring to budgetary constraints, that's one obvious one, and also policies. So the policies and to a certain extent the practices that you've had in effect at your workplace. Now, we know that, of course, management has this inherent right to manage. But labor arbitrators and courts in non-union settings have recognized the special nature of the employment relationship, something you're all familiar with. The law has developed so that employees are afforded a measure of job security through a combination of statutory and, for non-unionized employees, common law entitlements. Now, this diagram, I think it's a helpful one because it describes the kind of limitations that you have surrounding your management right. There are restrictive boundaries, and as mentioned, these are created through statute, common law, imposed limitations, etc. So it's useful to keep this in mind when you're attempting to achieve the objectives or goals of your organizations. So that being said, we have a management right. There's a broad-based management right. But as a general rule, even in a non-union setting, employees should not lose their jobs simply for making one mistake, unless the mistake is such that the employment relationship can reasonably be construed as having been breached. We refer to this as the whopper of a mistake. It is the instance where theft, destruction of property, perhaps an instance of workplace violence. These are the kinds of critical incidents that when they occur, it's relatively easy for an employer to step back, review the incident, and answer in their own minds, should this employee be fired? Well, that's one set. That's one type of incident. But the other, the more common complaint, and the one that we tend to receive or field from our clients, has to do with the other kind of substandard performance. And this is the habitually substandard employee, the one who you may refer to as the steaming cup of coffee guy. It's the individual who may saunter in at roughly 9 o'clock and then not start to work until about 10 or so, as they get their coffee and they chat with their co-workers. Pretty much every workplace has at least one of these. And it's difficult to know how to performance manage this type of employee in an effective way. They present a real challenge for their managers and for HR, primarily because they don't do anything that's sufficiently bad that they necessarily attract discipline right away, unlike that employee who does commit a theft or where there's an incident of workplace violence. So they can go unchecked, and they can go unchecked for quite a lengthy period of time. It could also be that they go unchecked because the manager to whom they report has a certain tolerance, for that behavior. And as HR professionals, you're mindful, and you're probably consistently saying to your supervisors and your managers, make sure that you apply, the rules uniformly across all departments. But from reality that some supervisors, some managers they might be a little bit more tolerant of things such as the individual who's habitually late. So there can also be a general reluctance to discipline or start, enacting a corrective action plan for an employee who is just a substandard performer. Sometimes it's a question of a supervisor or a manager who's just reluctant. The individual who is the substandard performer may be well-liked, they may be otherwise okay, and so the manager is not particularly compelled to discipline the individual. But there is a reason why it's important. If you're receiving feedback as the HR professional from a manager about substandard performance, there's a very good reason for making sure that you follow up on that kind of employee. The first is that if you don't, the behavior will not change. It absolutely will not change. And the longer that it's allowed to continue, the harder it's going to be to actually get that employee to perform more effectively. And this is the other fundamental element of performance management, and one that I know you're aware of, but it's useful to remind ourselves. Performance management, the purpose of it, is not to punish. It's to correct. And if you follow the basic precepts of progressive discipline, you'll be rewarded. You'll be rewarded, hopefully, with a rehabilitated employee. And if you're not rewarded in that way, what you will have done is to build a file that's sufficient to be able to support a just cause or a cause dismissal. Now, of course, we have some of you who work in a union setting, some who work in non-union, and you'll know from your experience that if you work in a union setting, that you are compelled to follow progressive discipline, or you won't prevail at the grievance and arbitration process. It's that simple. You simply won't be able to build the kind of disciplinary record that you need in order to terminate the employment who consistently fails to behave or perform to appropriate standards. And on this point, I want to add a footnote. It's not in the slides, but I was reminded when I was chatting with my colleagues about this presentation before it started about another element, which is performance reviews. If you have an employee who is on a corrective action plan and you start receiving performance reviews that don't align with the corrective action plan, take note, because it will be a problem if you have if you are trying to implement progressive discipline, but a manager or a supervisor is consistently giving excellence to this employee. You're going to have a hard time at grievance at the arbitration, because the employee will be looking at that performance review and will say, this doesn't make sense. So it's important for you to make sure that you always have that level of oversight and that there's consistency in terms of the messaging that's going out to the employee. In a non-union setting, it is easier. Your decisions will not be subjected to the grievance and arbitration procedures. However, like unionized employees, non-union employees are still subject to the employment statutes. So, for example, the Human Rights Code, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Employment Standards Act. Now, you may say, well, okay, but how does it matter then? Important to keep in mind, if you follow progressive discipline and you're rigorous about following progressive discipline in managing your employee in the non-union setting, then you'll have a better chance of making sure that the employee doesn't perceive the discipline as being somehow arbitrary or discriminatory in nature. If you have one sort of methodology for applying discipline, progressive discipline, and it's applied uniformly, it's very difficult for an employee to sit back and say, wait a minute, why is it that I'm being disciplined, in this manner, and someone else, over there was not? So keep in mind that it's not uncommon for an employee who has not previously been performance management and has not gone through the progressive discipline process I'll call it an appropriate way, to all of a sudden feel that they're being victimized. And it's not uncommon to see human rights claims or even potentially a claim of workplace bullying against the supervisor or the manager who is now applying progressive discipline. So just keep in mind that it's good reason to make sure that you've got uniform policies that are being applied across the board. Sorry. So this takes us to the Goldilocks Principle, which, as I mentioned, is not a term that I coined. It's actually a principle of astronomy that's used to explain the habitable zone. That is, the zone that is neither too hot nor too cold to support life. In economics, it's used to describe economic growth driven by spending, moderate inflation, and relatively low employment. So in other words, it's the perfect market condition. It's the place where there's balance and proportionality. Now, as part of our recommended approach for proactive management, we say that what we're recommending is a balanced approach to corrective action, one that follows the principles of progressive discipline. So let's talk a little bit about process. So in the progressive discipline, you understand what progressive discipline is, but at each stage of progressive discipline, you should be turning your mind to the elements that go into deciding whether or not that discipline is appropriate. The first part, and the critical part, is investigation. So it is incumbent on the employer to ensure that you've fully and properly investigated the behavior that might be attracting the discipline. In investigating, the next step is, of course, to document. Document, 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 and we continually say this. You cannot overpaper a file. It is so critical to make sure that you have kept your file notes, that there are memos, and that there are dates, as well as some information about the individual who actually made the file note that's going into this. Once the individuals who are responsible for the discipline are confident that the investigation is complete, that they've got the documents that they need, then the next step is analysis. So sit back and think about the situation and the context of the situation, and ask yourself as well, are there any mitigating factors? Is there anything else that I know of that's going on in the background that might explain this behavior? There's a tremendous amount of information that goes into the analysis. But if you're satisfied that the individual should in fact receive discipline for the substandard behavior, then communication is the next step. And that communication ideally should take place through a meeting, followed with some form of letter or document that identifies the meeting and what was discussed. Communication is key. The individual who's receiving the discipline, they need to understand what it is they did that was wrong, why it was wrong, and how to correct. In other words, what are the expectations of them on a go-forward basis? If all of those elements aren't covered, then the individual may step away from that meeting knowing that they've received discipline, but not really fully understanding what it is that they're expected to do on a go-forward basis in order to avoid receiving more discipline in the future. And then, of course, the next step is enforcement, follow through, and to make sure that, that once the decision has been made, that it is enforced. So progressive discipline, and I've touched on this already, implementing a corrective action plan. A corrective action plan, if the individual discipline is one step, this is more holistic. The corrective action plan is the system that is in place for managing that employee's behavior. A disciplinary system and associated standards, they're used to correct the performance issue. It has to be based on the standards, the rules and policies of the workplace, and importantly, as those have been communicated to the employees. And again, it must be corrective, not punitive. It must also be progressive, ranging from light to increasingly severe discipline. Now, the one caveat to that is that it may be that in your workplace you have certain behaviors that are identified through policy or perhaps even through a collective agreement, which do attract more severe discipline than others. And so it might be that you're jumping from, you may be skipping from, written warning to a more intense form of discipline if the infraction deals with one of those. The stages of progressive discipline, we know them well, but they consist generally of warnings, which can be a verbal warning and followed by a written warning, suspension, which may be 1 or 3 days or 5, and then termination of employment. What may precede termination of employment is a last chance agreement, and whether or not you're interested in offering that to the employee will really depend on the environment, the circumstances, and so on. I'll also point out that for many of employers and many of our clients, there are multiple steps to the written warning. It could be that there are 1, 2, 3 written warnings, and then suspension 1, 3, 5, etc. I don't think I've ever seen anything more than a 5-day suspension, but it is, of course, possible. So we'll move through these next slides fairly quickly, but we'll start with verbal warning with a memorandum to file. And verbal warning should be something along the lines of any further misconduct of X will result in further discipline up to and including dismissal. A verbal warning really isn't passing someone in the hallway when they've come in late and saying, hey, you should have been at your desk 10 or 15 minutes ago. So keep in mind that whenever you're issuing discipline that's in the formal discipline of your organization, that you do need to be making consistent notes to file. Now, I'll also, we've already touched on written warning. Again, very important to make sure that you outline the details of the misconduct, that you identify the standard or rule that was breached, identify any prior warnings as well, and reiterate the expectations. It may seem like you're in fact, what you're doing is probably a cut and paste from prior letters and making sure that you're adding into the next piece of the next written warning it's basically an update. The next step, so following the written warning, is suspension. And again, going through the same process with the employee, where you meet with them, you provide them with documentation regarding the nature of the misconduct, you identify the standard or rule that's been breached, you reiterate your expectations, and so on. And same for the 3-day suspension. Now, again, depending on whether you have you might end at 3-day suspension. If you go to 5, then obviously this is modified. Okay. And then, of course, step 5, optional, the 5-day suspension. Now, as a very last resort, if you've gone through all of that work and effort to performance manage an employee, and they're simply not getting the message, the behavior hasn't been corrected, then the very last resort is dismissal for cause. In the case of a dismissal for cause, again, you issue the letter the termination letter, you detail the misconduct, identify the standard or rule that was breached, and identify any prior warnings. So at this point, you know that there may be some action of some kind, whether it is grievance, whether it might be that the individual files a civil suit. You want to make sure that your documentation is absolutely in order and that you have repeated the expectations. So through this process, you will, those of you, again, who are unionized will be more familiar with this than others. But at any stage, written warning, one-day suspension, et cetera, it could be that you're faced with a grievance arbitration. In that case, the question will be, was there just cause? Was there a legally sufficient reason to discipline this individual? And by legally sufficient, it's important to keep in mind, at all steps, you need to be able to prove that the discipline was not arbitrary, unreasonable, discriminatory in nature, that the employee actually committed the offense with which he or she was charged, that the misconduct warranted corrective action or discipline, and then, of course, that it was just and appropriate, and finally, that mitigating factors were considered. Discharge for cause, again, the very last resort, it takes place after all efforts at correcting the employee's behavior have failed. And it may be appropriate, again, where the misconduct is of such a serious nature that management is left with no other option but to terminate the individual's employment. Establishing cause, if you've gone through and rigorously applied the progressive discipline and followed the steps in terms of investigating, documenting, analyzing, communicating, enforcing, then you should have a file that is already ready to go. You'll have the evidence of your witnesses. You'll have documentation pertaining to the misconduct. You'll have exhibits or things that would be helpful, and also any other evidence that might be helpful. And finally, I'm aware of very mindful of the time, but we do have as I said, a video presentation for you, and hopefully you'll enjoy this. We want to show the principle, the Goldilocks Principle in action. Now, the premise of this is that some employers discipline too harshly. They may suspend for 5 days or go directly to discharge without actually having followed the progressive discipline model. And that may be for any number of reasons. In other cases, and this is by my experience more common, the employer simply has been too slow to escalate the discipline through the appropriate stages. And then some employers really do get it right. And that's our focus for today. So with no further ado, I will, and hopefully this will work. So thank you, everybody, and I just want to extend a huge round of applause and thanks to all the associates who assisted in putting this together. So that included Carla Nasser, who was our Goldilocks, Jeff Ryans, Papa Bear, Russ Gross, Little Bear, and Deb Hudson, who kindly agreed to be Mama Bear. So thanks again. Hope you enjoyed.